O que aprendemos durante nossa jornada até aqui? Aprendemos que um futuro cada vez mais verde começa quando se faz muito além da obrigação. Aprendemos que com pequenas mudanças nos nossos hábitos, podemos reutilizar nossas embalagens. Aprendemos que é possível produzir mais cerveja com menos água, porque cada gota conta. Que a energia que nos move pode ser mais sustentável. E que só pode ensinar quem nunca para de aprender.
Cuidar do planeta e das pessoas. É assim que a gente usa a nossa energia. Afinal, um mundo melhor é reflexo das nossas atitudes. Com transparência e responsabilidade, buscamos a sustentabilidade em tudo que fazemos. Sabemos que mais do que qualquer promessa, o que vale é o exemplo. E se depender da gente, você sempre terá alguém com quem contar. Vamos agir juntos.
Melhorar a vida das pessoas hoje e garantir um planeta melhor para as futuras gerações. Nosso compromisso é transformar a realidade, gerando impacto positivo no meio ambiente e na sociedade por futuros mais azuis. Isso é prosperidade compartilhada. Esse é o nosso legado. A Egea, nossa natureza, movimenta a vida.
Olá a todos e a todas, eu sou Marina Filippe, repórter de ESG da Exame. Esse é mais um painel do especial do mês ESG e dessa vez eu tenho o prazer de conversar com a Lori Castillo, que é vice-presidente e chefe de equidade na Salesforce. Essa entrevista ela será conduzida em inglês e vocês podem acompanhar aqui o painel legendado. So, Lori, thank you for joining us. We will talk about diversity inclusion at Salesforce. And to start, I want to understand more how this works at Salesforce and how equality helps to the business.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here, and big shout out to all of our Salesforce ecosystem and all of our Salesforce folks out there. Now, for us, equality is a value of the company. It's not just a program, but it's something that really is a part of who we are at Salesforce, one of our core values. And so when we think about our commitment to equality, it's really embedded across all of our business. And primarily, we think about it in sort of a 5-pillar strategy. So the first is we always focus on advancing representation. So for us, that means both hiring and experience. And so focusing on that employee experience once you get into the company is our second pillar. And the third is that we always want to make sure that we're designing with those intentional systems. How do we make sure that we're changing the structure of how people experience the organization? And then, of course, being part of a global company, part of why I'm so excited to be here today is that you can't just focus on this from a US point of view. It's really something that we need to make sure we've got that global perspective, that we are not just, that we're really thinking about how do you localize the concept of equality for each country in which we do business, really understanding the history and experiences local to that market so that it's relevant. And then the last piece is really about our stakeholders. So the Salesforce ecosystem, it's not just our employees, but also our partners, our industry. How do we all work very closely together to have the impact we want within our communities where we do business? And so it's a very important part of, again, not just our employees' experience, but how we engage with our customers, key stakeholders, and in our communities to drive our business.
And why diversity and inclusion is so important to business?
You know, it's interesting. I spend a lot of time listening to our employees, listening to our communities, and we want to make sure that we have all of those perspectives built into the way we run our business. We are a reflection of our communities, our customers, and we know that inclusion drives better business. We looked at our own data within the organization, and we can see that where we have our most inclusive teams, we actually have better performance. So if I use sales as an example, we know that our most inclusive teams in our sales organization have 12% better sales attainment. And so that's directly impacting the bottom line of the organization. And we know in terms of our customers, when our customers see themselves reflected in who we are as an organization, there is that better connection, and we're able to work with them to better connect with their communities as well. And so it's really important that this is not just something that happens in isolation, but it's something that really happens across our ecosystem. And we see it reflected in our customers, our partners, and also how our employees show up for all of those different stakeholders as well. We also know it's important to our investors. As a publicly traded company, this is something that is a conversation. The whole topic of ESG is a very important topic that we think about across the board. We know not only do we have our value of equality, but also our value of sustainability. And it's these things together that really ensure that those values are not just what we say, but it's what we do and how we engage.
And a challenge on diversity and inclusion subject is how to be really inclusive and how to show these results. Could you give me more examples about that?
Sure. So, I think it's interesting, when I think about inclusion, this is something that, from an accountability perspective, we think a lot about. So I mentioned ESG. Last year, we made the decision to tie executive compensation to our ESG goals to make sure that we are driving meaningful results. If you think about, we have multi-year public goals. So transparency is so important to this process. So again, back to that topic of what you say, being close to what you do. You can go to equality.com and you can not only see our results, but we also have results for our partner ecosystem as well. And you can see these multi-year goals. And then on an annual basis, if you think about our ESG goals tied to compensation, these are anchors. These are things on an annual basis that help make sure that we're really driving to those multi-year results. And then on a regular basis, again, back to this theme of transparency, we really ground ourselves in data and make sure that we have dashboards. So if you're a leader in the organization, you can see not only how the company is doing, but how your organization is doing, how you're contributing to it. And again, from an inclusion perspective, I always tell people, well, it's important to have all these accountability measures. If we're going to be the most inclusive company, each and every day, every one of us can determine whether or not someone feels included in how we engage in a meeting, the people that we invite to our events, the conversations that we're having, the opportunity for people to bring their voice to the table. It's not just being there, but also make sure that we're really doing the deep listening and incorporating those perspectives in. And how do we know that we're doing that? We continue to measure that, whether it's through our surveys or through some of these representation goals. It must be a part of everything that we do. Otherwise, it is just words. It's not, to your point, it doesn't tie to those actions. But I also don't want people to walk away from this interview thinking that it's something someone else does. It's absolutely something every one of us in how we show up with the people we engage in our companies and in our wider ecosystems that are going to make the difference in whether or not people feel that sense of inclusion and belonging. and really feel like they can bring that full voice of themselves into the conversation.
And what is the secret to engage? Because it's not easy, right?
It's not. And I think some of it is, being curious. I think a lot of times people are afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, or they might not know all of the right language. And one of the things I would say we're really trying to do in our organization is pull some of that fear out of it. How do we actually just motivate people to feel that curiosity? We talk a lot about, there's two important things in this work. Part of it is grace, and the other is accountability. So when somebody maybe doesn't say the wrong thing, or maybe they don't say it exactly right, how do we create that opportunity for people to really learn? But at the same time, there's a point where, if people are maybe more seriously not saying the right thing or doing the right things, how do we make sure, and maybe not in our case, living our value of equality, how do we make sure we actually hold people accountable too? And if they're not aligned with our values, how do we make sure that there is accountability in the system so that, people know it's like some of those things are not okay. And so it's always a balance, right? Because you want to give people space and grace to learn. But there's also a point where you need to hold people accountable if they're not living to the values. And I think it's that balance is where there's opportunity. We talk a lot about, there's a lot of opportunity in the talent we have available. And so talent is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. And so how do we make sure that people have those opportunities to use their voice, to share their perspective? And then on the other side, how do we make sure our managers and leaders in our systems are open to receive that data, that we're doing that deep listening and have that curiosity and grace to really make sure that all of those voices are represented? And I would say every day, every one of us has an opportunity to be better in that space, because that is the hard part of this work, no doubt.
Yeah. And are the politics and practices the same in all countries, or is different in regions?
So I would say the core value of equality is global, but what that looks like country by country, I think it's really important to understand that these practices really need to be localized. That if you're a leader and you have a team that's based in multiple countries, really taking the time to deeply listen and understand what equality means to those communities and other countries is really important. And I think many multinational companies, we spend a lot of time, especially companies that are based in the US, we sometimes spend a lot of time with that US point of view. But I think for us, if we're really going to be effective, you actually have to go on the ground. You have to invest in resources and practices on the ground in local language to ensure that those nuances that are culturally relevant, that are really going to make a difference, that you, one, take the time to understand them, two, make sure that you are respecting them, and three, making sure that people understand how to use your voice in those countries so that when you're in those multinational settings, that your perspective is understood. Because I think sometimes the worst thing we can do is think, you can lift and shift from one country to the other. The biggest opportunity we have is to do that deep listening and really understand how to make these practices and these values both locally relevant and localized to the experiences of your employees and your teams on the ground. That's how we really start to make a difference and make sure that we're not losing things in that translation from country to country, or that it doesn't feel authentic. Again, if you feel like you're just getting something from a training or a practice from another country, it doesn't feel like it speaks to you. And I think the important part of this work is that you appreciate that nuance and that you are really bringing it to the realities of people on the ground in those countries and in those cities and offices. I think that's what starts to really make feel the difference and feel like the right investments are being made.
Mm-hmm. And Lori, I think it's important to talk about more about each minority group. So when we talk about gender, for example, what is the main challenge? What is working at Salesforce?
Yeah, I think it's interesting times. When you think about, one of the things that we do is we look at our data, across the board from a race and gender perspective in particular. And if I take a step back, when you think about this, if you're a company out there thinking about doing this work, again, there isn't just one set of values. Every country is going to have different relevance and a different history from an ethnicity perspective. So even the experiences from a gender point of view, I think some of they might look a little different, but some common topics is, one is representation. I think in every country, we can do better from a representation point of view. One of the things we announced last year was a global goal to get to 40% representation globally around the world by 2026. And then we've set goals each year to make sure that we're making good progress towards that multi-year goal. Because I think all of us want to make sure that we continue to improve representation. In some countries, that might be closer to 50-50. In other countries, it might be that you're trying to get to 20% representation or 30% representation based on the history and culture and nuances of that particular country. And so, again, I think it's really important to take the time to understand those nuances so that when you're setting those goals and really defining what improved experience looks like, you understand the landscape of the country in which you're doing business. I think the other piece is around understanding the barriers that might be involved for women in the workplace. In some countries, it might be childcare. In other countries, it might be something like safe transportation. In other countries, it might be traditional role of women in the household and in the family that might make it more difficult, or where you have to consider different benefits or different ways to support a broader family dynamic that you're trying to engage and provide for women in different countries. And so, again, I think it's really important to make sure that we're respectful of those practices and understand through that deep listening what women might want or need in that country or in that workplace to drive the best results. For some countries, it might be that we find ways to remove barriers for people to come into the office. In other countries, it might be we need to find ways to remove barriers to provide more virtual or remote opportunities. So again, I think taking the time to deeply listen makes a lot of difference. I think ethnicity and, topics related to religion, I think, again, are some things that are very, very country specific. And so my advice to people is don't make assumptions about what some of those barriers are. Make sure you're really listening and understand how you define ethnicity in the US versus Brazil versus Singapore versus India versus Europe is going to look quite different. And so, again, taking the time to understand the history and that you are building relevant programs that are supporting the communities in those different countries is really important. I think the one thing to keep in mind, and a learning that many people have, is that this isn't about fixing people of certain minorities. I think sometimes people think a development program is about fixing people. It's not about fixing the people. It's about fixing the system. Where do we need to break and redesign systems to make sure that there is opportunity across the board? And what needs to be done in that system, again, is going to look quite different country by country. And so really doing that deep examination and asking a lot of questions back to that curiosity and innovation will actually help us understand what nuances we might need to make in a particular country. I know in one of the biggest barriers that we can have is language, especially when you think about, again, a US or European multinational. Maybe many of the products or the things, our practices are documented in English. And in some countries, you have different levels of even English language competency. And so making sure that we're asking those questions and providing those resources is a really important part of this work, so that you have that localized relevance and localized language can be really powerful, and in a way to make sure that we're providing those opportunities more evenly.
And not just language, and how the company can contribute to reduction prejudice in technology, for example.
Absolutely. Understanding those biases is really, really critical. And again, how it shows up in one country versus another, and that's the localization piece of it, not just the translation, to your point about language. It's about that localizing and making sure that you've got that right relevance, so that we're not perpetuating issues more widely, I think is really critical.
Are there any example about that?
I would say, really understanding, I heard somebody describe it the other day as the seed. How do we make sure that the seed that we are scaling is been thought about from that equality point of view? How do we make sure we're not scaling something that's already broken? Making sure that we're going in eyes wide open and asking all of the right questions. Because the risk of technology is sometimes you can scale something that's already broken. And so how do you make sure that you're asking all those questions earlier in the process, so that that seed of what you're expanding has got all of those right trusted practices built in, I think is important. And that's where we come back to centering on our values, right? And every company should be thinking about that value of trust, that value of equality, this value of sustainability. How do we ensure that's built in right from the start? And then recognizing where we might need to break and redesign a few things, so that we can, reset that center, so that as we scale, we are scaling those trusted processes. I think that's something every company can think about and, make sure that we're really focused on, especially when it comes to technology.
Mm-hmm. And we are talking about minorities. Here in Brazil, a local challenge is about Black people, because the Black population is more than 0.5% of population. What is the challenge to improve this scenario when we talk about Black, indigenous, and traditional groups?
Yeah, I think it's if I use an example, so I think one is looking at your data with that lens. It's one thing to look at your data holistically. I think companies shouldn't be afraid to look at their data intersectionally. So looking at it from that perspective of not just the Black community or a particular race and ethnicity, but also looking at, say, for example, Black women as an intersection of race and gender. I think it can be very, very telling to really understand what some of the challenges are much more specifically. So if I use, one of the examples that we've looked at in the past is looking at our Black community specifically as it related to careers. What are some of the barriers specific to careers, and what are the things that we can put in place to support those communities? And so one of the things that we heard from quite a number of people was, there is this need for some additional support, access to networks, access to senior people. It wasn't about skills and competencies. It was about those relationships and those connections. And so we launched something we call the Warm Line, and it's specifically targeted to our Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and LGBTQ plus communities. And really, this is a space for people to call in and ask specific questions. And some of the things they ask about might be a relationship with a manager. How can I get some coaching on how to have a difficult conversation or courageous conversation with my manager? Another topic was around careers. It might be, I'm the first in my family to graduate from university. I'm not quite sure how to negotiate my salary, or I'm not quite sure how to have a conversation about promotion. And so the warm line is a place where they can have a conversation and specifically ask some of those questions and get connected to the right people. And then sometimes we do things we call warm line connections, which is about how do we connect the people who are hiring with the people who are looking for jobs. And so you create this opportunity where, again, we try to focus that equity piece where if they're not quite sure where the opportunities are, how do we create those opportunities for people to find each other? Because they may not have that same network or that same connection through their day to day. But how do we create that in our space so that those opportunities are more evenly distributed? And so that's something that we've got it staffed. It's something that we'll continue to invest in because, again, to your point, it can be very challenging, and we want to make sure that we have these resources available to people so that if they choose to opt into them, they can find them, they can ask those questions and get the support that they need to continue to drive their careers forward.
About career, a career in diversity and inclusion is something relatively new in the business in general. And what skills does this professional need to have?
So I would say there's a couple of things. So one is really understanding the systems and processes that you're working within. Because so much, if you want to have that long-term durable impact in your organization, you want to make sure that you understand, to your point earlier, like what are those systems, right? What are those things that are kind of built in because they weren't built with diversity or inclusion in mind? And how do we go back and better understand what might need to be fixed or tweaked or nuanced differently? And so I would say really understanding how those processes and systems work in the environment that you're working in is really important. And I think second thing is you have to show up with some curiosity and innovation. This work has been around in some countries for quite some time, and yet some of our challenges still persist. And so how do we need to rethink the way this work is done so that we can really innovate and be curious? And then the second thing, or the third thing I would say, is allyship. We can't change these things by ourselves. And so when I think about this work, it's about how do we go together in our communities, in our industries, with our customers and with our ecosystems to change the way we think about these topics. It's, no company is going to be able to do it on its own. No individual can do it on its own. No office, if you're in the diversity field, even a chief diversity officer, you can't do it alone. This is a team sport that all of us have to lean in and make sure that we are really a part of the change and a part of the solutions, and that we're really open and curious to doing things differently. That's actually going to be one of the most important skills. And so that influencing, that connection, that I would say meeting people where they are on this journey. Every individual is in a different place. And so how do we actually meet them where they are on the journey? Because I do think, again, each and every day, every single one of us, whether you're in the profession of diversity or you're a leader in the organization or you're an employee or in an organization, we can all make a difference on whether or not someone feels included and whether or not we have that, that long-term goal of equality for all we're all striving for.
It's a journey.
It is.
Yeah. And Lori, unfortunately, we are reaching the end of the conversation. We have just a couple of minutes. And I would like to know if there anything I didn't ask and is important to talk about when we talk about diversity and inclusion, of course.
Yeah, so I think there's probably just a few things I'd leave you with. So one is, if you're in this work, make sure that you set goals and that you're really looking at your data. not just what's right in front of you, but to your point earlier, that intersectional piece of it, looking at it by race, by gender, by those communities that are most important to your country or your environment, and be curious about what those solutions can be. I think it's important for all of us to make sure that, we're really, how do we all bring that value of equality into our day-to-day work? And you don't have to be an expert to do it. It's really important that every day, each and one of us figures out a way that we can drive a more inclusive culture whatever spaces we're showing up in and wherever we're doing our work. And that this is also not just, it's not just so we can all feel good. It's actually great for business. And it's something that we should all be investing in every country in the world.
Yeah, that's great. Lori, so thank you again for your time. Thank you for joining us. We are here in this special month, the ESG month here at Exame. So thank you so much again. Hoje eu falei com a Lori Castillo, ela é vice-presidente de equidade na Salesforce. A gente falou um pouquinho sobre diversidade e inclusão nesse painel que faz parte do mês ESG da Exame, com conteúdos já disponíveis aqui no YouTube e também no site. Até a próxima e muito obrigada.